Okay, being very much in election mood. I've been watching a documentary from 2015 about the famous 1945 general election, where it has been said that people cheered Churchill and voted Labour. That is partly true in the sense that there was a great paradox, but actually there were instances, where Churchill was openly booed in that election. It's a very interesting documentary. I'll put a link to it. 2015 BBC documentary, and it really lays out why Labour had such a landslide that year, despite the wartime leadership that Churchill had shown. I mean, it was a real shock to the establishment, to Churchill himself, and one of the most historic elections in British history. Just to lay out the figures of that election. So the Conservatives got 197 seats to Labour's 393. The popular vote was 11,967,746 votes for Labour, 8,716,211 votes for the Conservatives. So even in the popular vote, the discrepancy was clear to see. The Liberals under Sir Archibald Sinclair got 12 seats, and the Liberal Nationals under Ernest Brown got 11 seats. So this really was a landslide for Labour under Clement Attlee. I'm not going to go into a hugely comprehensive layout with this, but it's definitely one of the interesting aspects of British political history. There's a few things that can be observed. Firstly, the VE celebrations in 1945 in Trafalgar Square and elsewhere were kind of bittersweet because for many people it marked the end of World War II. But people forget that many of our soldiers were still out in the Far East, still in captivity by the Japanese, still dying. So for them, one can understand the slightly resentful feeling that they had that their sacrifice was somewhat being overlooked because the war wasn't over for a good, what was it, May to August? That would have been 3 more months. So to September, 4 more months. So that is one dynamic of the background of that election. The other thing was that it wasn't sort of convention, or it wasn't for granted, let's say, that service personnel would vote Tory. There's sometimes, even today, there's this notion that military men and women tend to be conservative, but actually a number of soldiers voted Labour in that election. And I think one reason was that people had, and this is laid out in the documentary, after World War One, Lord George famously said that there should be a country fit for heroes to live in, but that was somewhat a big letdown because great poverty and social divisions continued. Although the foundations of the welfare state had been laid by the Liberals in that era, it was still not fully implemented until the Attlee government of the late 40s. Um, so the Great Depression really hit hard, and it showed the severe deprivation that many people face. I mean, before that Attlee government, if you were poor, you were screwed. There was no welfare state. And it was people like Clement Attlee and Aneurin Bevan and Ernest Bevin and Beveridge and others who really, I don't think that we can underestimate how important that was. Herbert Morrison as well. I think one mistake that Churchill made, big mistake, was underestimating the feeling at home. He was genuinely revered by people on left and right. In fact, when the Great Britain study was done, survey back in 2002, Polly Toynbee, the Guardian writer, the Guardian journalist, pitched for Winston Churchill. So the fact he's revered in Britain is unquestionable, and with good reason. He was the wartime leader that got us through our darkest hour, and he's rightly revered for that. But I always feel that Churchill was the international statesman. I actually think on domestic policy areas, Churchill was quite out of touch in some ways. And I think this was highlighted by that 45 election, where he kind of took it for granted that because of his wartime popularity, he would win. And I also think that his dismissive attitude to his former Labour colleagues, bearing in mind it had been a national government, um, was not only dismissive, it was downright insulting at one point when he said that if the socialists get in, it would be like having the Gestapo. Now, that was a very crass insult, even by Churchill standards, to not only his colleagues in government, but Labour men who had served and risked their lives. Um, so I think that may have been one determining factor. I haven't watched the full documentary yet because I wanted to upload this now while I've got space on my computer. But there was one instance during the campaign when Churchill visited Walthamstow. So it showed that he was revered and cheered in Birmingham and Coventry, but when he visited Walthamstow, and you can see it in the archive, he was openly booed. And he was sort of a little taken back by this, and he kind of quipped, well, they're the booing party, but this wasn't Labour MPs, this was just ordinary voters. So it's true that Churchill is revered in this country, but it's also true that he wasn't always universally popular. I also heard an accolade that even in the war, when he visited Bristol during the Blitz and he said, we can take it, one housewife angrily said that Mr. Churchill, take it here. Bristol, of course, was one of the heaviest Blitz cities. Um, there's a lot of interesting anecdotes by senior Labour figures like Tony Benn and Denis Healey, both of whom served. Denis Healey was in the Sicily campaign, of course, a Labour chancellor in the 70s, grand old man of the Labour Party. So it's a very interesting documentary. I'll put a link to it. It's a little bit like, of course, a lot of the media establishment took it for granted that Labour would lose. And they didn't only win, they won with a landslide. It's a bit like the famous photo 5 years later, during the 1950 yeah, 1950 American election. Is that right? 1950? Anyway, when Harry Truman famously was reported by the Chicago Tribune to have been beaten, and the famous headline read, Dewey defeats Truman, referring to the Republican Thomas Dewey. But of course, Truman overcame adversity and won that election. So it was something similar for Labour in 45. The Beaverbrook Press was wrong. The Daily Express at that time, the largest newspaper, got it dead wrong. Now, I'm not trying to make any analogies for today, what will happen later on. I would be very shocked if Corbyn got a landslide, and I'd be pretty surprised if Corbyn won. But it does show that pundits can be wrong, and it does show that no party leader, no matter how popular, can afford to be complacent. Now, Johnson is not Churchill and Corbyn is not Attlee, but there may be surprises ahead. Um, anyway, it's a very interesting documentary. It's worth noting that Labour showed a lot more respect, I mean, at party level, to Churchill than Churchill showed to Labour. Attlee was well known to be a modest man, and Labour didn't even stand in Churchill's seat of Woodford in Essex. But there was one character, a rather eccentric farmer, who stood as an independent by the name of, let me get this right, um, Alexander Hancock. He got 10,488 to Churchill's 27,688. So this was a very interesting election, one of the biggest landslides in British electoral history. I may be wrong, but I think even bigger than 79 or 97. I'll be doing statistics on British general elections later because there's some very interesting data out there. But anyway, if you're interested in that period, the whole Churchill Attlee period, check out this documentary. It's very comprehensive. Um, it's a little bit too focused on Churchill. I think they should put a bit more focus on Attlee, which makes me think actually there's been a lot of films about Winston Churchill nothing on Clement Attlee. Yet Attlee was a lot more than a footnote to history, a lot more than, Churchill's footnote. He was a great man in his own right, very different persona from Churchill, not grandiose, um, but one of Britain's greatest prime ministers. I mean, it can be fairly said, I think, that Attlee was essentially the domestic prime minister in those years. I mean, Churchill's actual record and views on a whole range of issues, from the wealth poverty divisions in society to unemployment to healthcare, all those things were pretty mediocre at best. I think Churchill was out of touch with the sort of divisions that were still in society. And whilst the war had brought the country together after the VE Day, those divisions started to kind of emerge again, I think. People wanted a future, and this is something that Dennis Healy accurately pointed out. So there's a lot of interesting testimony from Churchill's daughter, from Attlee's daughter, from Elizabeth Nell, who's Churchill's private secretary. She just made a reference to that Walthamstow visit. But anyway, check it out. I'm sure there's many other talking points I can make with this, but I'll just put a link to the video. Check it out.